Hello, everybody. My name is Thomas Cameron. I'm the Chief Architect at Red Hat for the Central Region of the United States. And today we're going to be talking about transitioning from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6. As you know, Red Hat Satellite Server version 6 is in development. In fact, it's going to be going into a beta phase here in the next few weeks with a targeted release date of fall of this year. So I want to talk to you today about some of the practical steps that are going to be involved in transitioning from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6. Now, Satellite 6 is a complete rewrite. There is no common code between Satellite 5 and Satellite 6. So unfortunately, it's not going to be an upgrade process. It is going to be what we refer to as a transition process. So with that, I'd like to share my desktop and go over a slide deck that Todd Warner, who's the engineering manager, the product manager for Red Hat Satellite Server version 6, has put together so that we can talk about what this is going to look like. So let me share that. All right. So this is actually a draft version of this presentation. It's still not completely finalized because we are literally still writing some of the code that's going to be required for the transition tooling. And I'll talk about those when we get to them. So first off, let's talk about timelines. So Satellite 6 went through a managed design program, which is really a pre-beta release at the end of 2014. We took a lot of the lessons that we learned from the managed design program in 2013, and we're rolling those into a pretty significant redesign of the user experience for Satellite 6 in time for the beta. So the beta is, as I said, coming up in the next few weeks. And then release time, we haven't announced a firm release date, but it's going to be in the fall of this year. Well, fall for North America. It'll be the latter part of this year. And then from a transition timeline, there are a couple of important things that you need to be able to communicate to your customers. The first is that we have extended the life cycle for Satellite 5 all the way through Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 5's end of life. So Satellite 5 will be available through about the middle of 2019. What that means is customers have a very long runway in which they can make the transition from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6. So when Satellite 6 releases, certainly I hope that customers will adopt it. I do believe that customers will adopt it because it has a whole bunch of really nice features for very large scale systems management and deployment. And frankly, it is newer and more capable and more scalable than Satellite 5 was or is. So I think that there will be a lot of adoption. But the good news is there's no pressure for customers to transition. In fact, customers can run side by side Satellite 5 environments with Satellite 6 environments, and there's no real stress in doing that. So Satellite 5 has been around for 12 years. It's very mature. It's very well proven. It works really well. I love Satellite 5. But what we have found ourselves doing is kind of forcing more and more functionality into Satellite 5 in order to try to make it work in a cloud computing environment. And while it can be made to work for cloud computing, it's not optimal. So as we move towards a cloud computing, especially an open hybrid cloud computing model, we realize we really need to do a complete rewrite of Satellite with version 6, and I'll talk about what that looks like in just a little while. So Satellite 6 is coming in fall of 2014. It's definitely positioned for meeting the needs of new computing models and technologies. The design goal was to make sure that at GA, we would meet the requirements of 80% of the customers who are using Red Hat Satellite 5. And really, it was designed with an eye towards hyperscale computing, so very, very large computing environments with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of managed nodes. We eliminated some of the crazy challenges that we had with Satellite 5, like the lack of the ability for Satellite 5 to have multiple replicas. So it's a really neat suite of software. And I think that it's going to do really impressive things for customers, but there will be a transition process. And that transition will come in one of two models, either passive or active. And I'll talk about both of those. So in a passive transition, the Satellite 6 machine is brought in as a completely new platform. There is no eye towards actually doing much of a migration. Instead, new workloads will be brought up in the Satellite 6 environment, and we'll just leave the old systems which are being managed by Satellite 5 in that environment. Customer models their standard operating environments very similarly to Satellite 5, but really they're going to use Satellite 6 as an opportunity to kind of start fresh without having to reinvent the wheel. In this case, Satellite 5 and Satellite 6 would run next to each other for an extended period of time, and that's perfectly fine. Now, in an active transition, it's going to be a little bit different. Satellite 6 is seen as an upgrade, but I want to make clear again that there is not an actual upgrade path. You can't upgrade an existing Satellite 5 server to Satellite 6. But logically, the customers will see this as an upgrade. And so there will be an attempt made to transition standard operating environments, workloads, things like that as closely as possible. Customers will transition some or most or all of their objects, and those objects are users and groups and systems and things like that. Customers will want to transition some, most, or all of their systems from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6. So the goal in an active transition is we will move the clients registered to Satellite 5 over to Satellite 6, so that eventually the Satellite 5 environment will be retired. In this case, the timeline is that Satellite 5 will only exist for the duration of the process of moving objects, and then eventually the Satellite 5 environment will be shut down. Typically, or ideally, we would want that to be a 3-month transition cycle. David asks, would the transitioning period include .x releases for Satellite 5? So to be clear, Satellite 5.7 will be the last release of Satellite 5. Everything after that will only be maintenance releases. And Satellite 5.6, I think, is coming, at the end of this year. Don't quote me on that. I can't remember, but I think it's the end of this year. So yes, it will include the dot release, but there's only going to be the one dot release. So yeah, 5.7. All right, so let's talk about the components or the elements of the transition. From an architecture standpoint, you're going to still have the satellite server and the proxy, or in the terminology of Satellite 6, the proxy is now called the capsule, satellite capsule theme, marketing stuff. So the things that we're going to need to transition from the Satellite 5 environment over to the Satellite 6 environment include, obviously, your subscriptions, the infrastructure, and by that I mean the infrastructure layout, what subnets you have, what system groups you have, things like that. The objects in the database, including organizational objects, system definitions, and then the systems themselves. It will involve re-registering your machines. So a system that is currently subscribed or registered to a Satellite 5 environment would need to be re-registered to the Satellite 6 environment. Now, the tools are going to be a combination of software tools, knowledge tools, and process tools. So we're working on developing best practices documentation. So how to get from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6. I'm working on that. The systems management SME team in the SA organization inside of Red Hat is working on that. And obviously, our documentation folks in Brisbane are working on that as well. and I've been bugging the poor documentation folks in Brisbane on IRC more than any team should ever be bugged. So it's very actively being developed, and it should be a really good suite of documentation. So good things going on there. We're also going to be doing comparative best practices. So what was a best practice in Satellite 5 may or may not be a best practice in Satellite 6. We're also working on documenting where those do match and where they do not match. We're also, we have developed a document on how to use Satellite 5 in a Puppet environment. Since Satellite 6 relies on Puppet, obviously if we can make that transition smoother by educating Satellite 5 users, current Satellite 5 users, to go to Satellite 6 using Puppet, that's a good thing. Everybody wins there. We're working on general transition documentation. And because Satellite 6 is a complete rewrite, the API set is very different from Satellite 5. And you have to remember that with Satellite 5, when we originally developed it 12 years ago, we didn't expose any APIs. It was really a monolithic application stack. And API exposure was actually written in many years later because computing models changed and programming models changed. With Satellite 6, that's not the case. Satellite 6 has been built from the ground up to have every function, or practically every function, exposed via API, through the web UI, and through the command line. So the whole design process for Satellite 6 was intentionally made to expose everything via API calls. That being the case, because there are differences in architecture models between Satellite 5 and Satellite 6, some of the APIs are going to be very different. So we're doing a lot of work around good API documentation and guides and examples of, if you did it this way in Satellite 5, you're going to do it this way in Satellite 6. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of software tooling that's going to need to be done. That software tooling I will describe in a little bit more detail in just a little while, but there's work that's being done on that as well. Okay. Now, there are also procedural enablement processes going on around global support services. So we're doing internal training so that when Satellite 6 goes GA, all of our support organization will be ready to support it. There is courseware being developed for the release of Satellite 6 so that customers are going to be able to attend global learning services classes. And our consultants are also doing internal training. And in fact, we have consultants on the SME team internally at Red Hat to make sure that the knowledge that we're gaining from the SA organization, they're seeing in the consulting organization, and we're passing that information back and forth. And Todd put on here, prayer and salvation. There's been more than a little bit of that as well. There have been some pretty spirited conversations in the team meetings about the Satellite 6 transition. So it's been a pretty interesting time. All right. Now, in very broad terms, the architecture is logically very similar, almost the same between Satellite 5 and Satellite 6. What that means is you have the upstream provider of packages. In our case, that's rhn.redhat.com. And the satellite server is going to pull those packages down from RHN and cache them behind the firewall, or store them behind the firewall to speed up the application and distribution of those patches. Those are the same, those concepts are the same between Satellite 5 and Satellite 6. Now, when we start talking about things like proxies versus capsules, there are some differences. So in Red Hat Satellite 5, the proxy is not a very smart device. In other words, there's not a lot of logic there. It's really designed more as a bandwidth usage reduction tool than it is something that does smart systems management. In Satellite 6, the capsules actually do have some logic built into them. So as an example, in Satellite 5, the satellite proxy really just does gateway services between a local subnet and the upstream satellite server. It does some caching of packages to reduce bandwidth, And it does use 100% SSL top to bottom, and it provides for network hopping. In other words, if I'm going to be doing provisioning off of a local proxy server, all of the system registrations and things like that are still going to hop back upstream to the parent satellite server. Now, with Satellite 6, the capsule does all of those things, plus mirroring of content, mirroring of configuration files, and mirroring of software environments. And software environments are sort of analogous to what we had in Satellite 5 around system groups and things like that. I'll talk more about that in just a little while. It's also going to contain, the satellite capsule contains some management smarts. So you can actually do management on your local capsule server without having to have everything hop back upstream to the parent satellite server. And then there are also going to be network smarts. So each capsule has the ability of running local DNS and DHCP so that you can have pixie boots and kickstarts and things like that. So those are all going to be enabled in the capsule on each local network. Now, let's talk about transitioning subscriptions, the first part. Some of the things that are really challenging around transitioning includes subscription management. So if I'm going to stand up my Satellite 5 server and my Satellite 6 server, how do I entitle machines? Do I get twice the amount of entitlements? So there have been a lot of discussions in the design meetings about how do we carve up subscriptions so that both satellites can be active at the same time. So for every satellite to be transitioned, you're going to have a second satellite. So one that's Satellite 5 and one that's Satellite 6. Proxies and capsules are also going to need to be entitled correctly, and the product subscriptions need to be juggled. We need to figure out which subscriptions need to be associated with the Satellite 5 server versus the subscriptions that need to be with the Satellite 6 server. It's really important to understand that there are pricing and packaging considerations. Right now, this is not settled the way that we're going to do this, and that's really important to understand. Right now, we're currently looking at having a $0 satellite subscription for whatever the term of the transition time is. Like we talked about earlier, that should be around 3 months. We're expecting most transitions to take around 3 months. But if you have customers that have very, very large, very complex satellite environments, it's probably not realistic that they're going to be able to do that migration in 3 months. More than likely, and this is just Thomas's opinion, more than likely we're going to need to handle those on a case-by-case basis. We'll need to talk, the sales team will need to talk to the BU, and we'll figure out what the subscription model needs to look like for them to do the transition. So our objectives in this design work are to establish a reasonable time window. Again, we're thinking 3 months with potentially a 3-month extension if needed. And we're going to we're trying to figure out what makes the most sense from active transition and passive transition standpoints. In both cases, though, if it's there are financial considerations that we have to think about. If they're going to do an active transition where they're going to have the Satellite 5 server up, but we know it's going away, and our desired end state is to have everything on the Satellite 6 environment. Our goal there is to have no financial impact to the customer. This is, I think, going to be the most complex scenario from a subscription standpoint, because we're going to have to figure out how many subscriptions to allocate to the old satellite server, how many subscriptions to allocate to the new satellite server, and do the transition that way. If they're going to do a passive transition, where the intent is to have a long-term environment where they have both satellite infrastructures up and running, current thinking is that there will need to be 2 subscriptions for satellite, because they're going to be running 2 production satellite servers, and so there will be a cost associated with that. Just be aware of that. So the general process is going to look like this. The customer is going to need to announce their intentions to us. It is going to be up to us as solutions architects and consultants to work with those customers to make sure that they understand that when they are ready to transition, they need to engage us. They need to let us know, because that will allow us to have our global support services create a new a manifest for the Satellite 6 server. They're going to flag the customer account as a transition account. The customer is going to download and install Satellite 6. In the customer portal, the customer is going to free up some subscriptions. The nice thing about this is they can do this themselves if they so desire. They can go into access.redhat.com, free up subscriptions, make those available to the Satellite 6 environment, and create a new manifest for their Satellite 6 server. They're going to create the subscription management application for Satellite 6. They're going to transfer some of the subscriptions from Satellite 5 distributor to the Satellite 6 distributor. They're going to download the Satellite 6 manifest, install that manifest on the Satellite 6 server, and then they're going to need to start transitioning information from the Satellite 5 machine over to the Satellite 6 machine. So for the first iteration, they're going to transfer their organizations, their users, content, the environments, and I'll talk about what these terms are in a little while, system definitions and things like that. There will be tooling available. We don't have it yet. A lot of it is mocked up right now, and we've got initial runs of some of the software. But there will be tooling available that will allow you to have an intermediate system that'll basically log into the old satellite server, log into the new satellite server, and transition this information across. Then once they've done that, they'll need to then go create a new Satellite 5 certificate to downgrade or not downgrade, but to reduce the number of subscriptions which live on the Satellite 5 machine. And they'll continue this process iteratively. They will take some subscriptions away from Satellite 5, add those subscriptions to Satellite 6, and move systems over. So eventually what will happen is they'll be able to get all of their systems moved over to the Satellite 6 environment and retire the Satellite 5 server. So graphically, it looks like this. You start with your Satellite 5 machine up and running, where before we have a satellite certificate, which is an XML document. In Satellite 6, we have a satellite manifest, which is a zip file, and it contains a bunch of information about the satellite server. They're going to get that manifest. They're going to bring up the the Satellite 6 server. And then on a little closer bit of a view, what's going to happen is there will be tooling to migrate over organizations. Those organizations and the user accounts will be able to be pulled out of the Satellite 5 server into the Satellite 6 server. Also, there will be software tooling available that allows them to take their channels, which are, if you've worked with Satellite 5, you know that we've got channels for various operating systems and for layered technologies. Well, the concept of channels changes in Satellite 6. So part of the challenge is that we're going to need to have tooling that's going to understand the concept of channels in Satellite 5 and how those get pulled across to become repositories and views in Satellite 6. More on that in a minute. The next step is that with the tooling, we're not only going to pull over content, we're also going to pull over configurations. So we're going to be able to take config channels and content channels. They will become repositories with views on the Satellite 6 environment. Now, a couple of things to be aware of when we're talking about configuration management. In Satellite 5, configuration management was actually very simple. You could have a template for a configuration file, and you could use key value pairs with simple macro substitutions to do some customization of your configuration files. In Satellite 6, it's very different. Because we're using Puppet and we're able to push Puppet modules, you can actually use the Puppet domain-specific language to put a lot of really neat capabilities into Puppet modules. You know, you can do if this, then that, but only if this other thing is true. So you can set dependencies. You can set things like, well, I'm going to push a configuration for my web server, for instance, but oh yes, if I push the configuration for the web server, I can set a dependency that says that the web server package needs to be installed. So configuration management in Satellite 6 is much more rich and more capable. And with that does come a little bit of extra complexity. So the transition from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6, there's going to be a lot of technology and a lot of process around that, just to make sure that the customer understands the differences between Satellite 5's key value pairs versus true DSL-based Puppet module configuration in Satellite 6. So the process will involve really remodeling the life cycle. So where we used to have essentially just channel labels, we would have a channel label for development and a channel label for production, or sorry, development, and then maybe testing, and then production. That was something of a tedious process in Satellite 5. It worked very well, and with cloned channels, it was fairly easy to set up a discipline to enforce a software lifecycle management process. With Satellite 6, though, the concept of lifecycle management is built in. It's not a manual process. You get content from Red Hat or any other upstream repository, or even a local repository, and that content goes into the top level software repository in Satellite 6, which we call the library. Once something is in the library, we can layer on what we call content views. And with content views, we can do things like do included packages or excluded packages. So if you wanted to have a very customized, for instance, Kickstart, you could say, I only want a very small subset of the content of Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 7, for instance. So you would define that, what that subset is going to look like. You would also define what configurations you want to have on there. So Puppet modules, when you put those together, and you can actually have multiple versions of configurations and multiple versions of repositories or software package lists, that becomes views. And so the neat thing is you can layer these together and then promote those content views from the library, and you shouldn't ever subscribe systems to the library. You should subscribe them to one of the environments. So you can take the content from the library, promote that to your development environment, and then once you've got that all configured and tested and you've got your systems subscribed to the development environment, you can then promote that into your test environment and then do the same thing. Subscribe systems to the test environment, make sure that those work, and then finally, you can promote those into your production environment. So the workflow is very similar to what we did in Satellite 5, but it's more, I think it's a more logical workflow, and it's a more obvious workflow. In Satellite 5, if you didn't really understand channel cloning, you wouldn't do it. You would just subscribe everything to the upstream channels, and that could potentially be a problem. With Satellite 6, it's fairly intuitive how that life cycle works. So one of the other things that we're going to be changing from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6 is, everything that we did in Satellite 5 was essentially a kickstart. If you wanted to deploy new systems, you had to do everything through the Kickstart file. You would figure out what channels you want to subscribe to, use activation keys, put everything together, and kickstart your machines and do things in the post-installation section and so on and so forth. Now, we still kickstart systems with Satellite 6, to be clear, but it's a lot more rich in the way that we can do system definitions. As I mentioned earlier, we can have multiple content views, and those content views can be either software contents or configuration contents, and you can layer those together to come up with a very clean system definition of what you want your environment to look like. We still, just like we did with Satellite 5, we're still going to tie those together with activation keys, but with Satellite 6, We're going to use open source projects like Pulp for content management and Puppet for configuration management. I'm sorry, Pulp for repository management and Puppet for configuration management to layer all of those content views together to come up with system definitions. So when we talked about Kickstart profiles in Satellite 5, the new terminology that we would use in Satellite 6 would be more of system definitions and host group. So once we get the tooling built, once we get tooling in place, the goal will be that system groups, as we knew them in Satellite 5, will now become host collections. Activation keys will still be called activation keys, but they will have slightly different use cases in Satellite 6. But the beauty of it is that we're still going to be able to have a lot of the same concepts as far as, I know which system groups are doing what and what administrators might be managing them and things like that. But the big goal is that instead of having the old system groups as we had them in Satellite 5, now we'll talk about them in terms of host collections. And we can get granular with those host collections. You can do searches and show me the join of all of the systems which are running RHEL 5 and the systems which are running 64-bit operating systems and the systems which are running Apache, for instance. And so you can see from the diagram on the screen that you can do a lot of really neat searching to figure out, to be able to do ad hoc actions against those systems. Similar to what we had in Satellite 5, but not exactly the same. All right, so let's talk about the active transition path and system migration. So if you currently have an environment like this, where you have Satellite 5 and you have stood up a new Satellite 6 environment, what's going to happen is you're going to start registering systems or hosts to the new Satellite 6 server. So the same system that's currently registered to Satellite 5, you would then register to Satellite 6. And at the same time, that process that I discussed earlier, where you remove some subscriptions from your Satellite 5 environment and put those over into your Satellite 6 environment, you're going to do that process. And eventually, you may find that there are some systems that are registered to your Satellite 5 server, which you're going to consider as legacy, and they will never be transitioned. You're going to leave them connected to the Satellite 5 server until they go end of life. So we'll consider those to be legacy systems. Once the transition is completed, those systems which are intended to be managed from the Satellite 5 environment, from the Satellite 6 environment, once those are transitioned over and your Satellite 5 hosts, the systems which are managed by Satellite 5, once those go end of life, no problem. You can shut the satellite server down, the Satellite 5 server down, and you can archive that system. We will also be providing tooling for maintaining that archive, because there will be cases where customers need to be able to recreate their satellite server, but they don't necessarily want that satellite server to stay up and running. And so that's the 10,000-foot overview of the transition process. It's not going to be terribly difficult, I don't think, but there will be a lot of steps involved because the two technology suites are so radically different. So that's one thing that I do want to make clear. We are going to enable our field technical folks to be able to do this. We're going to have training. Our support organization is going to be available. We're doing a lot of internal development work of training guides and best practices. So it's not going to be difficult, but it is going to be time consuming. And you're absolutely going to need to talk with your customers to determine whether they want to go the active route or the passive route. And there may be financial considerations depending on which path they choose. But again, the goal is to make this as easy as possible. It is my hope, and I think that this is going to happen. It is my hope that Satellite 5 is actually going to see a significant adoption rate. When we talked about historical updates to satellite, 5.4 to 5.5, a lot of customers would adopt it, but maybe they would do it fairly slowly. Because the differences between satellite 5 and satellite 6 are so great, and because the capabilities of satellite 6 are so much greater than those of satellite 5, I do suspect that we are going to see significant customer uptake and adoption of satellite 6. So if you haven't yet, I strongly recommend that you start getting familiar with satellite 6. The bits are available. The beta is coming. If you're an internal Red Hat employee, you can certainly download the bits from our internal build servers, and I do recommend that you do download that software. So let me take a look at the questions. Stand by. Okay, hang on just a second. I'm going to have to scroll up just a little bit. A lot of good questions. Stand by 1 second, folks. All right. Okay, so David asked, so capsules, SmartWise, is it two-way? Yes, it is two-way syncable. Does it require writing an errata note for custom packages upgrades to work? Not that I'm aware of. I'll be honest with you, I haven't done that yet. But I haven't read through any of the initial documentation. I haven't seen in the documentation where it's required, but honestly, I'm not 100% sure. Most of the testing that I've been doing has been core functionality of just getting it up and running and synchronized. I uncovered a couple of really painful bugs around building new satellite servers that unfortunately it was downloading about 50 gigabytes of data every time you did a synchronization. And so that kind of stopped my testing. And then I had OpenStack Summit and Red Hat Summit, and I haven't spent as much time as I should have. I'm sorry. But I'll follow up on that. Aurelian, okay, that was a comment. Oh, yeah, I do agree. Having to develop custom errata is a pain. Piece of string question, 200 rel servers equals how long passive migration? Jeff, you know what, man? The answer to that depends on whether they want to do an active transition or a passive transition. And here's what I mean. If they don't want to keep the history of those 200 servers, like if they don't care about, historical updates and things like that, like the information that's on the satellite 5 server, if they don't care about that, honestly, you could stand up a satellite 6 server, run a remote command from the satellite 5 server to those clients, those 200 machines, and have them re-register with the satellite 6 server, and you could be done. You could do it in an afternoon. Now, that's super aggressive, and you wouldn't maintain any of the history because all that stuff would be on the satellite 5 machine. But if you wanted to do a transition where you were going to leave the satellite 5 server up and do this, maybe 50 servers at a time or 20 servers at a time, that could be as little as a couple of weeks to as long as a year. It's really going to be predicated on what the customer's risk aversion is, what their comfort level is, whether they've gone through training. And that's going to be up to us as field technical staff to help them out with any proofs of concept that they want to do, maybe help them out setting it up in a lab environment, set up a couple of example machines, do a simple transition, things like that. Me personally, the tests that I've done where I have my satellite 5 environment and I just kick off a remote command on the managed systems and have them re-register to the satellite 6 environment, that takes minutes to do. And so if you don't care about the data that's on the satellite 5 box, if you just want to have it go away once you're done with the transition, very, very short time frame. All right. Are we creating any tool for migration from SAT5 to SAT6 for easy deployment? Yes. Right now, Cliff Perry's engineering group is working on an intermediate that's going to run on a client system that's going to basically log into the satellite 5 machine and also log into the satellite 6 machine and pull out users, groups, system groups, and turn those into repositories and content views and kickstarts and activation keys on the satellite 6 machine. It's not going to pull everything across because there are some things which simply do not exist in Satellite 6 that used to exist in 5. But yes, we are working on tools to help this be a lot easier. Let's see. On top of Sukanta's question, especially database information migration. Okay, so one thing to be very aware of, the database in Satellite 6 is actually, there are two components to the database. There's MongoDB that's being used for content management, package management, and then there's Postgres for the rest of the system, so users and groups and system definitions and things like that. There is not a one-to-one mapping from Satellite 5 to Satellite 6 in the database. So while we can pull information out of the Satellite 5 database and populate it in the Satellite 6 database, the table names aren't the same, the schema is not the same. It's literally going to be an ETL process. We're going to extract, transform, and load into the Satellite 6 machine. So let's be real clear that the database structure is very different between Satellite 5 and Satellite 6. Okay, Jonathan asks, will the components be separable, i.e. have the Puppet component on one server and the Pulp component on another, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So sort of. The capsules can be, you can install multiple capsules, and so you can have content management, you can have kickstarts and config management. But as far as having something like a dedicated Puppet server or a dedicated Pulp server, I don't believe so. Now, that raises an interesting question. What about those customers who already have Puppet environments? The design goal for Satellite 6 is that we can integrate with existing Puppet environments. So if they're running Puppet Enterprise or something like that, we're not going to say, oh, you have to tear all that down and start from scratch. The goal is to have it integrate directly. The integration tooling is not, that I know of, ready yet, so I can't speak to how easy or hard that is, but we are very aware, the engineering group is very aware that there are a lot of customers who already have Puppet out there, and they don't want us to be conflicting with existing Puppet infrastructures. All right. What happened? Oh, yeah. Good question, Kyung. What happens if the customer uses Satellite 5 with SAM, with Subscription Asset Manager? We can't use the Satellite 5 Subscription Asset Management data. I don't know the technical reasons for it, but that was one of the questions that I asked was, well, if we have the Subscription Asset Management, can we just pull the information from there? And the answer that I received was, no, we cannot. So unfortunately, the SAM database is not going to do us any good. It kills me. I'm not happy about it, but that's the answer that I got from engineering. David asks, what about a Puppet consolidation tool? People may not want to pay for Puppet Enterprise and they have Satellite. So that's a very delicate question. We are relying on technology that Puppet Labs has developed. The reality is they are an ecosystem partner of ours. They are very good members of the open source community. So we have to be sensitive, and frankly, we don't want to hurt them. We don't want to take business away from them, if we can avoid it. Now, customers will almost certainly say exactly that. Well, why should I continue to use Puppet Enterprise if I'm using Satellite Server? That's fine. If they make that decision themselves, we will certainly support that. But there will probably be some manual process there for customers to take their existing Puppet environments and bring those into the Satellite Server. Be aware also that Puppet Enterprise contains features like Puppet DB and management tools, which we may have analogs to inside of Satellite, but the version of Puppet that Satellite uses is very similar to the version of Cobbler, for instance, that we have with Satellite 5. It's intended to be an appliance. It's not intended to be a full-featured instance or implementation of Puppet. So if they're using Puppet Enterprise, they may or may not want to go with satellite as their only Puppet provider. That's something that we will have to help them determine on a case-by-case basis. And again, Thomas's opinion, this is just my opinion. Puppet Labs has been a phenomenal partner of ours. They've been a phenomenal contributor to the open source community. I believe that it is the right thing to do to not just go in there and hammer them. That's just my opinion. All right. No? All right. So are there any other questions? Feel free to, if you want to, I think you can do audio as well. All right, I'm not seeing any more. What was that? What was that? Somebody just turned on their audio and I'm getting crazy feedback. Okay. I am seeing any more questions in the feed. This presentation will be available. I'm going to get it to Quentin here in just a few minutes. If you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. I am thomas@redhat.com. Real easy to reach. You can also reach me on IRC. I am Choirboy on Freenode and also internal Red Hat IRC as well. So unless there are any other questions, I am going to say thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here at the services conference. It's a big honor for me to come here, and I appreciate the hospitality that I've been shown here in APAC. And I look forward to seeing you at the next session, and again, hopefully next year. Thank you very much.